Welcome to Murder Mystery, the podcast where we explore the darkest crimes and the people behind them. Today, we unravel the story of a woman who appeared to be a caring nurse, but who was hiding a chilling secret that has shocked an entire nation. Lucy Letby. The name is now synonymous with unimaginable horror. Just last year, this seemingly unassuming 34-year-old nurse was convicted of the most heinous crimes, murdering 7 premature babies and attempting to kill 6 others in the neonatal unit of an English hospital. Her actions have made her the most prolific child serial killer in British history. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence that led to her conviction, a recent trial and the conversations it has sparked have left some questioning whether justice was truly served. Could Lucy Letby, the so-called Angel of Death, be innocent? Dubbed the Vanilla Killer by the media, Lucy Letby's life outside the hospital was as ordinary as it gets, or so it seemed. She lived alone in a nondescript 3-bedroom home, where the decor was strikingly childlike. Her bedroom was filled with stuffed toys and trinkets, a stark contrast to the monstrous acts she was accused of committing. It's this very contrast between her innocent, almost goofy persona and the horrific nature of her crimes that has left so many people in utter disbelief. But beneath this facade of normalcy and innocence, Letby found different, insidious ways to inflict unimaginable pain on her tiny victims. These were not crimes of passion or violence carried out in a moment of anger. They were calculated, cold-blooded acts of cruelty that left experienced pediatricians utterly shattered. The cries of her victims were described as tortured screams, sounds so haunting that seasoned pediatricians, people who had dedicated their lives to caring for children, were left traumatized. Some had to take extended leave from work to process what they had witnessed. They had encountered suffering before, but nothing could have prepared them for the horror that unfolded under Letby's care. What makes Lucy Letby's crimes even more disturbing is how she managed to evade detection for so long, despite repeated warnings from consultants who noticed the alarming pattern of deaths under her care. Between June 2015 and June 2016, Letby embarked on a killing spree, preying on the most vulnerable infants, tiny, premature babies who could fit in the palm of her hand. Despite the growing concern among her colleagues, who raised the alarm multiple times, hospital management failed to act. Letby continued her horrifying campaign of violence, using methods as cruel as they were calculated. She would inject air or insulin into the baby's bloodstreams or feeding tubes, causing catastrophic collapses and, ultimately, death. In some instances, she took things even further, ramming medical equipment down their throats, causing them to bleed profusely as they lay helpless in their cots. Her victims included sets of twins and triplets, siblings who should have had their entire lives ahead of them, cut down in their most fragile state. Among them were 2 boys from a set of identical triplets, murdered within 24 hours of each other. Shockingly, Letby carried out these killings just days after returning from a week-long holiday in Ibiza, as if the horrors she was inflicting had no impact on her otherwise ordinary life. The Countess of Chester Hospital, nestled in the north of England, became the backdrop for a series of unimaginable crimes that would later horrify the nation. Lucy Letby's callous killing spree began on June 8, 2015, just a day after she joined her colleagues at a boozy bachelorette party, a gathering full of laughter and celebration, where no one could have guessed the horrors that were about to unfold. Letby's first victim, known only as Baby A, was born 6 weeks prematurely. He was barely a day old when he was handed into the care of Letby at 8 p.m. that fateful evening. In the hands of someone who had taken an oath to care for and protect, Baby A should have been safe. But within an hour, the infant would be dead. Hospital staff were heartbroken and baffled. They couldn't understand why none of the usual resuscitation techniques worked. Every effort to revive Baby A failed, leaving the medical team questioning what had gone wrong. Little did they know that the tragedy wasn't due to natural causes, nor was it a freak medical anomaly. It was a deliberate act of murder. And the most chilling part? The person responsible for this atrocity was one of their own. Lucy Letby, the nurse entrusted with Baby A's care, had injected air into his tiny bloodstream, causing a fatal air embolism. And she was far from finished. Less than 28 hours later, Letby struck again, this time targeting baby A's twin sister. She injected air into the infant, just as she had done with her brother. The little girl stopped breathing, her life hanging by a thread. But this time, medics were able to revive her, narrowly saving her from the same fate that had claimed her brother's life. The hospital staff were shaken, but the true horror of what was happening on their ward had not yet been revealed. They were dealing with a killer in their midst, someone who seemed to relish the power she held over these fragile lives. And then, just a week later, Letby struck again. Her next victim, baby C, was even more vulnerable than the others, a tiny newborn, born 7 weeks prematurely and weighing just 800 grams, or 1 pound 12 ounces. Despite his size, baby C fought valiantly for life. But under Letby's care, his fight would come to a tragic end. Lucy Letby's method of killing was as calculated as it was cruel. By injecting air into the bloodstreams of these helpless infants, she caused catastrophic damage that often resulted in sudden, unexplained collapses. Each death was a devastating blow to the medical staff, who were left questioning their own abilities and the inexplicable tragedies they were witnessing. But the full extent of Letby's crimes was still unfolding. She continued to work alongside her colleagues, attending to other infants with the same outward appearance of professionalism and care. No one suspected that the woman who seemed so dedicated to her job was, in reality, a cold-blooded killer. The chilling story of Lucy Letby's killing spree continues to unfold, revealing the depths of her cruelty and the shocking failures that allowed her to continue her reign of terror. On June 13th, Letby targeted another innocent victim. Looming over the defenseless baby, she injected air into his stomach. What followed was a desperate 6-hour battle as doctors tried everything in their power to save the boy's life. Despite their heroic efforts, Letby's lethal actions were too much to overcome. Just days later, on June 22nd, Letby struck again, taking the life of her third victim, child D. She injected air into the baby girl's bloodstream, causing her to collapse 3 times before succumbing to her injuries. Each collapse brought the medical team to the brink, as they fought to revive the tiny life slipping through their fingers. Just days later, on June 22nd, Letby struck again, taking the life of her third victim, child D. She injected air into the baby girl's bloodstream, causing her to collapse 3 times before succumbing to her injuries. Each collapse brought the medical team to the brink, as they fought to revive the tiny life slipping through their fingers. But in the end, Letby's cruel intentions won out, and another life was tragically lost. It's almost unthinkable, but despite the back-to-back tragedies, all occurring while Letby was on duty and present in the ward, the deaths were not immediately connected. Hospital staff were devastated, left questioning what could possibly be causing these mysterious collapses and deaths among their most vulnerable patients. And yet, the true cause of the carnage remained hidden in plain sight. It wasn't until much later that a chilling handwritten note was discovered among Letby's belongings. In it, she confessed, "I am evil. I did this. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them." The note laid bare the twisted thoughts of a woman who had betrayed the very essence of her profession. But Letby wasn't done. Her killing spree continued into August when she claimed the life of child E on August 4th. This tiny infant, weighing just 1.4 kilograms, never stood a chance. And the very next day, Letby attempted to kill child E's twin, child F, by lacing his feeding bag with insulin. Miraculously, the boy survived. But the trauma of these back-to-back attacks would haunt the medical staff and the families forever. In September, Letby turned her attention to her smallest victim yet, child G, who was born 15 weeks prematurely, weighing just 450 grams. Over the course of that month, Letby made 3 separate attempts to end the little girl's life. While child G survived, she was left severely disabled, her life forever altered by the nurse who was supposed to care for her. Then, on October 23rd, Lucy Letby carried out one of her most horrifying acts. In what was later described as a persistent, calculated, and cold-blooded attack, she murdered her next victim, Child I, after 4 excruciating attempts to take the baby's life. The brutality and persistence of Letby's methods were beyond comprehension. By the end of that month, some hospital staff finally began to raise concerns about the horrifying pattern of deaths that seemed to follow Letby wherever she went. But even as suspicions mounted, senior managers at the hospital refused to act. Instead of investigating or removing her from the neonatal unit, they chose to dismiss the concerns, allowing Letby to continue her deadly work. Her final victims came in June 2016, Child O and Child P, 2 of a set of premature triplets. Over the course of 24 hours, Letby snuffed out their lives by injecting air into their nasogastric tubes. It was only after these tragic deaths, nearly a year after her killing spree began, that the alarm was finally raised and Letby was removed from the ward. But even then, the response was shockingly inadequate. Despite the pediatrician's growing suspicions and their desperate attempts to alert the hospital administration, the executives hesitated. When they finally did remove Letby from the neonatal unit, they didn't fire her or suspend her. Instead, they reassigned her to a desk job in the patient safety department, a cruel irony given the lives she had taken. After nearly a year of unchecked terror at the Countess of Chester Hospital, Lucy Letby was finally arrested in July 2018. The charges were as horrifying as they were numerous: multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. By November 2020, the full scope of her crimes had been laid out, and the public would soon learn the true extent of the horrors that had occurred under her care. In October 2022, Letby was hauled into court for what would become one of the longest and most shocking criminal cases in British history. It was here, in the cold, sterile confines of the courtroom, that the full horror of her heinous acts was finally exposed, a nightmare for every parent and a tragedy that left the entire nation appalled. During the trial, the court heard how Letby, after committing her unspeakable crimes, would often comfort the grieving parents of the children she had murdered. In a sickening display of deceit, she even sent sympathy cards to the families after their infants' funerals, playing the role of the compassionate nurse who had tried her best to save their little ones. She told mothers and fathers, "Trust me, I'm a nurse," before attacking their innocent newborns, some as young as 23 weeks old. After killing one child, Letby texted a colleague, recounting the father's heart-wrenching grief. "Dad was on the floor crying, saying, 'Please don't take our baby away,' when I took him to the mortuary. It's just heartbreaking. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do." But what was perhaps most chilling was Letby's demeanor after each of her murders. Far from being remorseful, she appeared animated and excited, often volunteering to bathe, dress, and even take photographs of the bodies of her tiny victims. This disturbing behavior led the prosecution to suggest that her motive might have been rooted in a twisted desire to play God, deriving a perverse thrill from holding the power of life and death in her hands. Equally unsettling was the revelation that Letby had been involved in a clandestine affair with a married doctor at the hospital. The two had exchanged hundreds of messages, and prosecutors speculated that her infatuation with this doctor may have fueled some of her crimes. They suggested that Letby targeted babies specifically to create crisis situations that would require his attention, further feeding her need for control and admiration. Letby's methods of attack were as varied as they were sinister. She injected infants with air, causing fatal embolisms, overfed them until their tiny bodies could no longer cope, poisoned them with insulin, leading to hypoglycemic episodes, and even assaulted them with medical tools. Each method was carefully chosen to exploit the vulnerabilities of the babies in her care, ensuring that her crimes would be as devastating as possible. The trial painted a picture of a woman who was both beige and average in her outward appearance, but who harbored a dark, twisted psyche beneath the surface. Her lack of contrition, combined with her methodical approach to murder, left many wondering what could have driven her to commit such monstrous acts. While her true motive may remain unclear, The prosecution's theory that Letby was motivated by a combination of a God complex and a desire to impress her lover is chilling enough. The case raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the terrifying reality that those who appear the most ordinary can sometimes be the most dangerous. The tale of Lucy Letby grows darker as we delve into the psychological and familial dynamics that may have played a role in her heinous actions. Letby, an only child, was the apple of her parents' eyes, especially her mother, who was fiercely protective of her daughter. When police arrived to arrest Letby, her mother's anguished cries echoed through the quiet streets. "I did it. Take me instead," she pleaded, desperate to shield her child from the consequences of her actions. But beneath this outward display of love and devotion, the court heard that Letby's relationship with her parents was far from ideal. The bond between Letby and her parents, particularly her mother, was described as suffocating, a stifling presence that left her feeling trapped. The pressure of being their only child, combined with the weight of their expectations, may have contributed to the psychological turmoil that festered within her. Despite the overwhelming evidence presented against her, Letby has continued to insist on her innocence. Even as she faced the court, the police, and the grieving families of her victims, she maintained a facade of denial. To this day, investigators have been unable to definitively determine a clear motive behind her actions, leaving many to speculate about what drove her to commit such unspeakable crimes. However, a brief and chilling insight into her mental state was revealed through a haunting confession found in her diary. In this unsettling entry, Letby wrote, "I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." The words offer a glimpse into a mind tormented by feelings of inadequacy and despair. She went on to lament, "I will never have children or marry or know what it's like to have a family." These confessions suggest a deep-seated sense of hopelessness and self-loathing, emotions that may have fueled her desire to destroy the lives of others. The contents of Letby's diary paint a disturbing picture of a woman who felt unworthy of life's most basic joys: love, family, and happiness. It's as if she believed that by taking away the lives of others, she was somehow confirming her own darkest fears about herself. Her actions were a twisted reflection of her inner turmoil, a horrifying manifestation of her belief that she would never experience the normal, fulfilling life she so desperately craved. For many, there is no doubt that Lucy Letby is the worst child serial killer in British history. The horrific details of her crimes, the heartbreaking stories of the families affected, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence presented in court have painted a picture of a woman who betrayed the very trust placed in her as a nurse. Yet, despite the court's verdict, a growing number of people outside the courtroom are beginning to question the narrative that has been laid out. In recent months, a swell of naysayers has emerged, proclaiming Letby's innocence. These voices, though in the minority, have been vocal in their attempts to cast doubt on the evidence presented at her trial. They point out that there was no direct forensic evidence linking Letby to the crimes, no fingerprints, no DNA, no smoking gun that could definitively prove her guilt. Additionally, no one witnessed Letby causing harm to any of the babies under her care. This lack of direct evidence has become a focal point for those who believe that Letby has been wrongly convicted. They argue that the case against her was built on circumstantial evidence, anecdotal accounts, and what they see as the unreliable testimony of doctors and nurses who were under immense pressure to explain the tragic deaths on the neonatal unit. The prosecution's case indeed relied heavily on the testimony of medical professionals who worked alongside Letby. Doctors and nurses recounted their suspicions, noting the strange pattern of deaths and near-fatal collapses that seemed to follow Letby wherever she worked. They spoke of her presence during critical moments, her eagerness to be involved, and her peculiar behavior in the aftermath of these tragedies. But for some, these accounts are not enough to convict someone of such heinous crimes. In addition to witness testimony, the prosecution leaned heavily on statistical evidence and expert opinions on complex medical points, evidence that was often difficult for the lay jury to fully grasp. Over the course of the trial, days were spent explaining intricate medical concepts, with experts debating the significance of blood gas readings, insulin levels, and other nuanced data points. The reliance on these complicated, often abstract, pieces of evidence has fueled skepticism among Letby supporters, who argue that such evidence is too uncertain to serve as the foundation for a murder conviction. These skeptics question whether the deaths could have been due to other, less sinister causes, undetected infections, medical errors, or even the inherent fragility of the premature babies themselves. They suggest that the hospital, desperate to find an explanation for the tragic and inexplicable deaths, may have unfairly focused on Letby as a convenient scapegoat. Despite these doubts, the jury found the evidence convincing enough to return a guilty verdict, and Letby was convicted of multiple murders and attempted murders. But the controversy surrounding the case has sparked a broader debate about the nature of justice, the reliability of expert testimony, and the challenges of prosecuting complex medical cases. Is it possible that the court made a mistake? Or are these doubts simply the result of a public struggling to come to terms with the idea that someone so ordinary, so unassuming, could be capable of such extraordinary evil? The question of Letby's guilt may continue to haunt the public consciousness for years to come, as we grapple with the chilling possibility that sometimes the darkest truths are the hardest to accept. As the dust begins to settle on Lucy Letby's trial, the debate over her guilt continues to rage, with some questioning whether justice was truly served. One of the most prominent voices in this growing chorus of doubt is Richard Gill, an emeritus professor of mathematics at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Gill is no stranger to controversial cases. He was involved in 2 previous instances where statistical coincidence was wrongly used to convict nurses of murdering their patients. These cases bear an eerie resemblance to Letby's, leading him to speak out against the methods used to secure her conviction. Gill, who has faced backlash for his outspoken views, took to social media during the trial to challenge the statistical evidence presented by the prosecution. He claimed that the shift table, a key piece of evidence used to link Letby to the deaths of the infants, was meaningless, and that she had suffered a miscarriage of justice. The police investigation and Crown prosecution made all the mistakes the Royal Statistical Society warned about, Gill asserted. Nobody studied the statistics in a professional way. These bold claims have fueled a firestorm of controversy, with some rallying behind Gill's assertion that Letby was unfairly targeted. They argue that the statistical evidence, which played a crucial role in the case, was not handled with the rigor and expertise it required. For them, this raises the possibility that Letby was convicted not because she was guilty, but because the numbers were misunderstood or misrepresented. The doubts don't stop with Gill. Online forums and social media platforms have become hotbeds of speculation, with many users insisting that Letby simply couldn't be the person responsible for the horrific crimes attributed to her. They struggle to reconcile the image of a young, seemingly caring nurse with the monstrous acts of poisoning helpless babies with insulin, overfeeding them milk, injecting air into their veins to cause fatal embolisms, or ramming medical instruments into their mouths. The very idea that someone entrusted with the care of the most vulnerable could commit such atrocities is too much for some to accept. In these corners of the internet, the narrative shifts from Letby as a cold-blooded killer to Letby as the victim of a modern-day witch hunt. To these supporters, she is a convenient scapegoat for a failing neonatal unit, an easy target for senior doctors desperate to deflect blame from themselves as babies continue to die on their watch. In their view, it was easier for those in charge to point the finger at a junior colleague than to admit that systemic failures within the hospital might have contributed to these tragic deaths. This alternative theory has gained traction among a small but vocal group of Letby supporters who believe that the real culprits are the hospital administrators and senior doctors who, in their desperation to find a cause for the deaths, zeroed in on Letby without sufficient evidence. They argue that the investigation was flawed from the outset, tainted by confirmation bias and a rush to judgment that overlooked other potential explanations for the tragic deaths on the unit. But as these voices of dissent grow louder, they also raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the reliability of expert testimony in complex cases like this one. Is it possible that Lucy Letby was convicted not because of overwhelming evidence, but because of a flawed interpretation of data and a need to find someone to blame. As the controversy surrounding Lucy Letby continues to unfold, some critics have taken aim at the scientific evidence used to convict her. They argue that the tests for air embolism and insulin poisoning, which were central to the prosecution's case, were flawed or misinterpreted. Adding to the complexity, some supporters even suggest that Letby's defense team was inadequate and failed to provide a robust challenge to the prosecution's claims. The narrative around Letby's case was further complicated by a lengthy 13,000-word article published in The New Yorker shortly before the retrial began. This piece, which has sparked significant debate, raised the notion that Letby might have been wrongly convicted. It introduced alternative theories, including the possibility of undetectable bacteria in sewage contributing to the deaths and the idea that Letby was merely a scapegoat for broader medical failings within the hospital. The article was controversial, not just for its content, but because it was blocked from being read online in the UK and reported to the Attorney General for potentially breaching contempt laws. These laws had restricted UK media from discussing the case in detail before the retrial, highlighting the sensitive nature of the ongoing legal proceedings. However, this article has been criticized for missing key pieces of evidence from the court case. Critics argue that while it presents alternative theories, it fails to fully address the overwhelming body of evidence presented during the trial. This omission has led some to question the validity of the claims made in the article and whether they offer a balanced perspective on the case. In contrast, the Daily Mail's true crime podcast series, The Trial of Lucy Letby, has been providing detailed, moment-by-moment coverage of the trial. This podcast, currently ranked #1 in the true crime podcast charts, offers in-depth analysis and reporting that closely follows the evidence as it was presented to the jury. Hosted by Daily Mail reporter Liz Hull, who attended every day of the trial, and broadcast journalist Caroline Cheatham, the series includes weekly updates, expert interviews, and insights from detectives and the relatives of the victims.